Perhaps we may all get bothered to ask, why should we study indigenous knowledge systems across our respective disciplines? Why is the course important to us? Yet, that is not the actual areas of our specialties. I may want to tell you that a course on Indigenous Knowledge Systems, IKS, is set to explore the traditional wisdom in areas of counseling, psychology, theology, medicine, agriculture, and governance, and compares with Western science, focusing on oral traditions, ethics, intellectual property rights, and sustainable development by using participatory methods to integrate indigenous knowledge with modern context for community-driven solutions that covers diverse themes from ecosystems to processing and assessment through discussions, projects, and exams. So, Indigenous Knowledge Systems as a course is gaining currency across the various universities for its significant positioning in academia, because we realize as we go along that we may not do justice to academia if we ignore indigenous knowledge, because it has its unique contribution that cannot be bypassed today in the 21st century. So why should university students study the course on indigenous knowledge system? I should say perhaps that university students should study indigenous knowledge systems, IKS, in order to gain a more holistic, sustainable, and ethically informed perspective on global challenges, bridging the gap between Western empirical science and ethically informed perspectives on global challenges, bridging the gap between Western empirical science and time-tested traditional wisdom. Incorporating indigenous knowledge systems into university curricula fosters critical thinking, cultural respect, and decolonial perspectives, transforming higher education into a more inclusive environment that addresses local contexts that we are in, and further, it ushers us into a more inclusive environment that addresses local contexts rather than focusing solely on Eurocentric paradigms. We may consider key reasons for university students studying indigenous knowledge systems that include enhancing environmental sustainability and stewardship. And as I noted earlier, time-tested solutions can be explained by considering that indigenous knowledge systems offers invaluable time-tested practices for diversity, conservation, land management, and agricultural resilience such as intercropping, agroforestry, and traditional fire management. You may talk of climate adaptation, which is to do with the pastoral and agricultural communities having developed resilient strategies to manage resources amidst environmental stresses. Within the enhanced environmental sustainability and stewardship, we may talk of holistic ecological view, in which case indigenous knowledge systems emphasize the interconnectedness of humans and nature, providing a necessary counterpoint to individual models that often lead to environmental degradation. Another point to consider as a key reason for university students studying indigenous knowledge system is to do with decolonizing knowledge and promoting equity. So in that, we consider the fact that indigenous knowledge systems as a study challenges dominant paradigms. So the course confronts the historical marginalizations of non-Western knowledge, challenges the assumption that only Western empirical science is valid. Another point to do with decolonizing is cognitive justice. It fosters what I would call epistemic pluralism. That is to do with recognizing multiple ways of knowing as complementary rather than competing. The other point to do with decolonizing knowledge is to do with reconciliation. For many centuries, integrating indigenous knowledge systems is a crucial step toward reconciliation and acknowledging the rights of indigenous communities. The third point or reason that justifies the study of indigenous knowledge to university students is holistic learning and critical thinking. In other words, it offers interdisciplinary approaches. Indeed, indigenous knowledge systems is inherently holistic, blending science, philosophy, spirituality, religion, theology, and social structure, which enhances interdisciplinary thinking. Another point on holistic learning as a reason for studying it is contextual understanding. IKS encourages students to think critically about how knowledge is validated, moving beyond theoretical knowledge to practical community-based solutions. And the other point is improved academic performance. IKS, how does IKS improve academic performance? Now, studies indicate that contextualizing education with local knowledge increases student engagement, empowerment, and success. Fourth point on justifying the study of IKS within the university structure or within the curriculum is practical application in modern professions. Now, we should say that healthcare and medicine is one practical application in modern professions. For integrating indigenous healing practices with modern science enhances treatment effectiveness and cultural relevance. You remember the time of COVID-19, we have employed a lot of indigenous forms of treating people or medicine, and it has worked. The other practical application is entrepreneurship and management. Now, students learn to develop sustainable, locally relevant business models that respect community values and environmental limitations. The last one on application is governance. Indigenous knowledge systems provide insights into indigenous governance, leadership, and dispute resolution systems. The last point on why university students should study indigenous knowledge system is to do with cultural preservation and identity. I should add that cultural preservation and identity includes preserving heritage and cultural pride. So learning indigenous knowledge systems helps prevent the loss of traditional knowledge as elders pass away, retaining crucial information about landscapes and ecological relationships. Now, with cultural pride, you note that for indigenous students, it validates their heritage within the university setting, fostering a stronger sense of belonging and empowerment. Now, by embracing indigenous knowledge systems, university students are better equipped to tackle complex, modern problems with a nuanced, inclusive, and sustainable approach. We may also now want to consider a few other things, not necessarily addressing the university students, but generally about indigenous knowledge systems. We may even ask, what do we mean by knowledge systems? That's a general question, but it is very important because you cannot study a subject without an introduction. So this is where we should have begun, but we didn't have to have a very formal way of starting something. We can have it our own way. We can start it in our own way. So what do you mean by knowledge systems? Knowledge systems are structured frameworks that incorporates people, they incorporate institutions, they incorporate practices that generate, validate, manage, and apply knowledge. They encompass both formal data-driven methods like science and indigenous, holistic, or local understandings, shaping how communities interpret their environment and make decisions. Some of the key characteristics and types of knowledge systems that we know in the world include components. And when we say components, we mean that which consists of knowledge producers like universities, experts. It also incorporates or consists users, meaning policy makers, and intermediaries supported by structures, cultures, and values. Another characteristics and type of knowledge system include indigenous and local knowledge systems. That is to do with the dynamic bodies of knowledge passed down through generations via oral traditions, which are deeply rooted in local culture and ecosystems, for example, medicine, agriculture, and so on. Another key characteristics of knowledge systems is academic knowledge system. Academic knowledge system, AKS. These are systems based on explicit, empirical, formal methods, often applied within academic or technical institutions. Another key characteristic and type of knowledge system is knowledge-based system, AI, or artificial intelligence. Now, computer programs that use a knowledge base and an inference engine to solve complex problems, often simulating human expertise. So AI, or knowledge-based system, AI, that is programs that use knowledge base to solve complex problems through inference engine that simulate human expertise are also part of modern day knowledge system. So we are not compelled to considering Western versus indigenous knowledge. There is AI knowledge or knowledge-based systems. They have come. Another one is Western Academic Knowledge Systems, WKS, Western Knowledge Systems or Western Academic Knowledge Systems, which are frameworks rooted in European cultural values, prioritizing rationalism, empirical evidence, and objective quantitative analysis. There is also Asian Knowledge Systems, AKS, which are holistic, dynamic, intergenerational frameworks encompassing indigenous, traditional, and local wisdom that bred cultural, spiritual, and ecological understanding. Of course, there are functions. These indigenous knowledge systems, not indigenous, these knowledge systems in general. Of course, we have considered various types of knowledge systems. All of them, the Western knowledge systems, Asian knowledge system, indigenous knowledge systems, African indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous and local knowledge systems, academic knowledge systems, all these, they facilitate the sharing, storage, and application of information for instance, sustainable ecosystem management, policy making, and innovation. Now, these systems are not merely information repositories, but complex, evolving structures integral to societal development. Major knowledge systems in the world include Western science knowledge systems, whose focus seeks universal laws and often separates facts from values, and whose foundation is based on the scientific method, rigorous experimentation, and peer review. Another one is indigenous knowledge systems that we'll consider in great length here, which is characteristically place-based, dynamic, and passed down orally through generations, and whose application focuses on deep understanding of local ecology, biodiversity, I've noted that, sustainable resource management, agriculture, and medicinal plants, and whose examples include traditional Chinese medicine, the Indians, Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, which we call acupuncture, and ecological knowledge of local and ethnic communities worldwide. We also have traditional knowledge systems on its own, where cultural transmissions features through stories, legends, folklores, rituals, and songs, and whose scope includes techniques for hunting, agriculture, ethnoastronomy, and navigation. The other type of major knowledge system is what we call ancient stroke Eastern intellectual traditions, such as the Indian knowledge systems, which displays a vast repository of ancient traditions, philosophies, and science, e.g. yoga, Vedas, Vrikshavenda, and Chinese intellectual tradition, which includes the so-called TCM, meaning traditional Chinese medicine, and other philosophies that emphasize balance and harmony, and which characteristically interweaves science with philosophy, ethics, and spirituality, aiming for wisdom rather than just information. Now, when we look at indigenous knowledge systems alone, without necessarily going to all those Chinese intellectual tradition, ancient stroke Eastern intellectual traditions, traditional knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge system, Western knowledge system, if we focus specifically on indigenous knowledge system, there are those who feel that it is a foundational knowledge. And they argue that IKS are increasingly getting recognized as foundational knowledge, providing essential time-tested and context-specific insights necessary for sustainable development, environmental management, and community resilience. Unlike modern or Western scientific knowledge, IKS is deeply rooted in local culture, transmitted orally across generations, and holistic, encompassing ecological, spiritual, and social dimensions. There are, of course, resilient characteristics of indigenous knowledge systems. Now, indigenous knowledge systems are inherently resilient due to their dynamic, context-specific, and holistic nature, developed over generations to help communities thrive amidst environmental and social variability. They nurture developed over generations to help communities thrive amidst environmental and social variability. They represent a nested information practice worldview system that enables adaptation to climate shocks and environmental changes. Now, some of the key resilient characteristics of indigenous knowledge systems include 1. Adaptive and dynamic capacity, 2. Holistic and interconnected worldview, 3. Local context-specific and place-based, 4. Intergenerational transmission, 5. Strong social cohesion and governance, 6. Ethical and value-oriented framework, 7. Experimental and empirical base. Now, these characteristics enable indigenous communities to maintain cultural identity and function effectively during periods of stress. Some of the indigenous peoples who produce indigenous knowledge systems include the Ogiek, Bongo, San, Khoi, Viehenda. They create indigenous knowledge systems through generations of observation, cultural practice, and interaction with their local ecosystem. These ecosystems or these systems covering biodiversity, agriculture, medicine are deeply rooted in tradition and often passed down through oral, experiential, and at times gender-specific method. In particular, the Ogiek people of Kenya are known for traditional management practices in the Mau Forest, including beekeeping or honey production, and foraging or meaning hunting, which are sustainable and protect local biodiversity. Similarly, the San and Khoi peoples of Southern Africa, they possess extensive knowledge regarding arid landscape management, medicinal plants, and cultural heritage, often mobilizing this knowledge to assert land rights. Further, the Vahavenda people of South Africa employ indigenous knowledge in ethnobotany, local climate prediction, and natural resource management, passed down through lived experience. Additionally, the Bongo people, that is Papua New Guinea, they utilize ecological indicators, bird, insect, and weed behavior for farming, alongside storing seeds in specialized traditional granaries. Now, indigenous peoples in Europe, primarily located in the Arctic and Nordic regions, maintain rich localized knowledge systems regarding sustainable environmental framework, or management, reindeer hunting and biodiversity. The Sami people in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia are the most prominent, alongside Greenland's Inuits, people called Inuits from Greenland, who are indigenous peoples. These systems integrate traditional, intergenerational knowledge of ecosystems with modern adaptation strategies. As the Arctic's oldest indigenous group, Sami people possess extensive knowledge of reindeer husbandry, nomadic pastoralism, and Arctic ecology. Now, Greenlandic Inuit are the indigenous population of Greenland, a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Their knowledge systems are deeply rooted in hunting, marine ecosystems, and adaptation to extreme cold. Now, various groups in northern Russia, over 4,000 recognized, they hold specific knowledge of taiga and tundra ecosystems. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the original inhabitants of Australia. That is, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, or Islander peoples, with a continuous culture stretching back over 60,000 years, comprising diverse groups with unique languages and customs. They represent 3.2% of the total Australian population. These distinct cultures maintain deep connections to land, sea, and community. They comprise of hundreds of distinct language groups, produce diverse intergenerational knowledge systems developed over 65,000 years plus years. These systems include scientific, ecological, and cultural knowledge, e.g., or for example, traditional fire management, astronomy, medicine, all embedded in oral traditions, art, and practices passed down by elders and community members. Now, key aspects of Australian Indigenous knowledge system include 1. Scientific and ecological knowledge, 2. Traditional fire management, 3. Cultural and social identity, 4. Intergenerational transmission, modern application, and so on. Now, having said that, you note that they too, whether they are in the Aboriginals of Australia, whether they are Arctic and Nordic of Europe, Norway, Sweden, Finland, or the Samis of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, Sami people, all these people we have considered across the world in Denmark and other places, they share with indigenous knowledge system. What's wrong of Africa? As long as the indigenous, they provide knowledge, indigenous knowledge, all these types of indigenous knowledge across the world, they are interconnected, or they have lots of commonalities therein. So it's not a question of, because they are aboriginals of Australia, they are radically different from those of Africa. Or indigenous Chinese, they have something common with those of Africa, those of India, or those of Europe. So indigenous people are not just African people, they are all over. Even they are indigenous people of Europe, and they practice indigenous forms of knowledge. Having said that, we'll stop there and consider next time the actual indigenous, the meaning of indigenous knowledge systems specifically, without necessarily getting into generalities. Thank you so much.